Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Ellie Marney is an award-winning, internationally successful YA crime author with multiple titles to her name, including the brand new, spine-chilling, edge-of-your-seat psychological thriller None Shall Sleep, published in Australia by Allen Unwin. And I'm delighted to be chatting with Ellie on the podcast today. Hi, Ellie.
Hi, Claudine. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, this novel was just wow. I think I've been as terrified since I watched The Silence of the Lambs. This book was just sensational.
Thank you. I was saying it still gives me a thrill to hear that people are reading the books that I write, and this book is particularly um, close to my heart. So yeah, I'm rapt that you enjoyed it, and I hope everyone does.
Oh, look, honestly, I'm sure they will. Now, before we get started talking about the novel in detail, Ellie, I was wondering if you might tell us how you started writing crime.
Okay. So I had started writing way back in the day, short stories. So I started with adult short stories and then moved into entering competitions, which is kind of one point of entry, I think, for a lot of Australian writers, where you enter comps and see how you go, and it gives you a bit of feedback and also a bit of an understanding of what the publishing market is like, I guess. And I entered a short story in the Sisters in Crime Scarlet Stiletto Awards. Sisters in Crime are really amazing. They're like a grassroots organisation that advocates for and promotes Australian female identifying crime authors. They've been going for a while and they're connected to their UK parent organisation. And every year they run the Scarlet Stilettos, which is, I think, these days the most lucrative story competition in Australia, which is pretty amazing. So I entered in 2009 and came second. So I thought, oh, that's pretty good. And then I wrote another story and entered into 2010 and I won. I won that year. And that was a real surprise to me, but also a pleasurable surprise. And I just enjoyed writing those stories so much that when it came time for me to start thinking, about writing a novel, which I'd been kind of working up to, I think, for a while, I decided that I would go in that direction. And I knew I would write YA because YA has always been my first love. And when I went into high school libraries to investigate a little bit to see what was on the shelves, I shouldn't say that I just wandered randomly into high school libraries. I'm a high school teacher by profession, so I was getting to see what was on my high school library shelf, and there just didn't seem to be much there. A lot of the crime and thriller stories that were on the shelves were actually adult fiction. So I sort of thought, well, there's a gap on the shelves here that no one has really thought to fill. And I think there was one book that was written by Lily Wilkinson called A Pocket Full of Eyes, and that was the only YA crime story. It was a little murder mystery, a bit of a Trixie Belden style mystery. And I thought, well, if she's the only YA crime author in Australia, then maybe I could join in. So that was when I started, and I've kind of never really moved past that initial interest in crime and creating it for teenage audiences.
So then, where did you get the inspiration for None Shall Sleep?
I was going to say I should preface that, my interest in crime stories has been going on for some time. I mean, I've written in and read in a variety of genres and, particularly science fiction and fantasy. But I was one of those kids who read all of the Agatha Christie books back in my teens. And I read all of Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes canon. And, I just found the whole the whole genre completely fascinating. And then when I was in my early 20s, I picked up a copy of the book Mindhunter by John Douglas. And that was actually the book that they turned into the Netflix series, which a few people might be familiar with. And when I read that, I was just transfixed. I was completely fascinated with this idea of exploring the psychopathology of serial killers, and also the idea of the FBI setting up this unit, which was it was completely out there at the time. Like nobody had ever thought to go into jails and into mental institutions and interview serial killers to find out more about how they thought and behaved. And when the idea first came up in the early 70s, I don't think they were anticipating that it would become such a key part of FBI strategy, like investigative strategy. But yeah, the whole idea of this unit that was being set up in the early 70s that was doing really innovative, risk taking things. And I thought, well, in that first 10 years of them creating the unit, maybe they would do something equally innovative and risk taking and recruit a couple of teenagers to find out more about teenage serial offenders. So that was where the idea came from, I guess.
I was going to ask you why you said it in 1982, but I guess I've just had my answer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, they were doing some very, very wacky things. I mean, the CIA was, experimenting with LSD and ESP and all that sort of stuff in like the late 60s, early 70s. And then the FBI was trying new investigative techniques. The guys who started the unit, it was originally started by a man called Howard Teeton, and he recruited Douglas, who'd come from hostage negotiation background, and then he moved into the unit, and he had those kind of people skills that allowed him to interact with offenders. And he'd gone to deliver a lecture, and while he was there, he thought he would go and speak to a serial killer in the nearby jail, and that was the first time he'd interviewed somebody like that. And he was able to develop this rapport, and I thought it makes sense that they might recruit teenage interviewers to talk to teen subjects. I mean, it does sound a little bit out there, but the FBI was actually doing some pretty out there things back in the 70s and early 80s.
Okay, so as I've mentioned in my introduction, I absolutely loved this book and I've had the pleasure of, ripping through it
Thank you.
recently. But for those who haven't read it yet, can you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Okay, so it's set in 1982, as we mentioned, and two teenagers, Emma Lewis and Travis Bell, are recruited by the FBI to interview teenage serial murderers. And they both have understanding of serial offender behaviour. So Emma is the sole survivor of a serial killer who attacked women back when she was 16. And Travis Bell is the other part of the team, and his father was murdered. His father was a US Marshal, and he was murdered by a serial offender during an arrest. Emma is studying psychology in her first year of college, and Travis is, on his way towards a law enforcement career himself, and they're approached to join this unit. And then what happens is one of the subjects that they're asked to interview is a notorious juvenile sociopath called Simon Goodmanson. So when they go in to interview him, they realise that he has insights into an active homicide case that the FBI are currently pursuing. So they realise that they're going to have to go back and get more information from Simon Goodmanson about what might be happening in this case. And, they get drawn further and further into the active investigation, which is something they're not supposed to be doing. And also they're dealing with this guy, Simon, who's incredibly manipulative. And, they can never really tell whether or not he's giving them good information or what his hidden agenda is. And he always has an agenda. So yeah, that's the basis of the story.
So, where did you get the inspiration for the character of Simon, the sociopath?
Simon. Well, look, he's kind of like a mashup of all my favorite weird serial killers and serial killer characters. So, there's a dose of Hannibal Lecter there, which I'm sure you picked up. He's incredibly bright. He's highly sophisticated, comes from a very privileged background. There's also a lot of people like Ed Kemper and Ted Bundy kind of winding their way through his personality, because Kemper was highly intelligent, and Ted Bundy has this amazing cobra-like charm that he used to persuade victims to go with him, or basically to get under people's skin. So there were elements of each of these characters. I had to do a lot of reading about serial killers, and those were the two that really stood out. I added quite a lot of those kinds of ingredients to Simon's personality.
You mentioned obviously that you had to do a lot of reading about serial killers, but a book of this nature is really heavy on details concerning FBI procedure. I imagine this would require a fair bit of research. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little about your process in bringing this story to life.
I did contact the FBI, which is kind of weird to be contacting the FBI. But yeah, they actually have like a public relations department that deals with inquiries from film directors and random writers that contact them. So yeah, I was in touch with them, and they were very closed-mouthed, I guess you'd say. They don't really want to give you too many details, but it was good to contact them and get a sense of what the organisation was like. Because it's set 40 years ago, I had to do so much research into processes of law and order and criminal investigation back in the early 80s. And I did a lot of reading. I read a book called The Institute by a guy called Ronald Kessler, and also read a lot of first person accounts on people's blogs when they have a National Academy program that runs through the FBI at Quantico training. People from law enforcement all over the US can attend the National Academy, and some of those people have written first-person blogs detailing their experiences of what it was like to train there and what the buildings and grounds are like and stuff like that. So that gave me some insight into what the environment of Quantico is like. I did also spend a lot of time examining serial killers and reading up on juvenile serial killers and reading, manuals of serial offender investigative techniques and things like that. That was kind of weird and grim. There was some gory stuff involved and some quite scary stuff involved in the research. The biggest thing was I had to spend a lot of time on Google Maps looking up roads, because my characters are often getting in cars and driving to jails and things like that. I spent a lot of time going, oh, now I have to track this highway that goes through West Virginia. What are the landmarks? Are they the same as the landmarks that were there in 1982? That sort of thing. So you spend a lot of time trying to track the ant track, I guess, of your character's journey through the landscape, which is kind of funny.
I understand now the reasons why you decided to set the story in 1982, but there would have been particular challenges to law enforcement procedures back then that we don't have these days. I mean, we're, not assisted by the internet and telephone.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
They had a basic computer system that was, kind of in its infancy still, where they were setting up a database of offenders. So that was something that was already there, but it was still very much baby steps, nothing like what we would think of as a comprehensive database. And also the computers were used for calculating things like potential directions of travel of an offender. If they had, dropped the if the murder site was here, how many potential places could they have gone on the highway? That sort of basic calculation stuff. So they did have some access to computers, but there was a lot that they didn't have. Like everything was still being faxed. There was no email, there was no mobile phones. So, it was actually kind of refreshing to be operating within those restrictions, because when you add mobile phones to a crime story, immediately the story changes. Being able to contact each other straight away and email each other instantaneously is a massive hiccup when it comes to, isolating your characters or sending them out into a lonely road. I mean, that was actually, interestingly enough, one of the things that I found out when I was researching was that that's why investigators these days believe that there are fewer serial offenders murdering people, is because everyone's got a mobile phone and people are trackable by their phone. So it's harder for people to get lost. Yeah, so that was kind of fascinating.
It also occurred to me that probably DNA analysis wasn't as sophisticated back then.
Yeah, look, you could tell if someone, had particular blood type. There was a lot you could analyze, but yeah, no, DNA didn't come into use in criminal investigation and was not applicable in a court of law until 1985. So I was actually operating, in a DNA-less world.
Which is probably good for your serial killer.
Works quite well for serial killers. Yeah, this is going to sound really weird, but the 70s and 80s are considered like the golden age of serial killers.
Okay, so let's talk about Travis Bell and Emma Lewis for a minute. Where did your inspiration for this dynamic duo come from?
I started with Emma. She leads the narrative, for most of the story. And I wanted to have a central female teenage protagonist. When you're writing YA crime, this is just an aside, but maybe this is a tip for any of your listeners out there who are writing YA crime. One of the central difficulties you have writing in this genre is you have to find a way to give your teenagers agency in the narrative. Crime, criminal investigation, and law enforcement are very adult worlds. It's very difficult to insert them into like a full on homicide investigation without giving them some kind of role or some, you have to put them in a situation where they're active participants. And giving them that kind of agency is quite hard. In fact, that's almost always, the first question you have to answer as a YA crime writer. You have to figure out how are they going to make decisions and move the narrative forward when they are in a position of no authority. The first thing you do is you have to give them some kind of connection to the case. You have to make them a witness. You have to make them involved in the action in some way. In this situation, how would Emma be an authority on serial killers? And I thought, well, I wanted to give her the ability to understand serial killer thought patterns and behavior, and in a way that would make her a good candidate to be an interviewer. And the only way she could do that would be to either be highly educated about serial killers, like to be have some sort of advanced psychology degree, which seemed a bit implausible because she's only 18. And then I thought, well, the only other way would be through first-hand experience. So that's why I made her a trauma survivor. And also I find female trauma survivors on the page and on the screen, I find them completely compelling. They're very driven. They're often very angry and they're very tough. You can't really look away from them. They just push the story forward in really surprising and interesting ways. I think of people like Ellen Ripley, from Aliens. She's I guess the character that I most closely associate with Emma. When I was writing the book, this was in late 2018, early 2019, Emma Gonzalez, who was the leader of the anti-NRA, anti-gun movement after the Parkland shootings in the US, she was on television and in the media a lot. And this image of this young woman with this amazing buzz cut hair, she directly inspired that image of Emma as this young woman, incredibly tough, has been through incredible trauma. She's buzzed her hair. She really means business. That was where Emma came from, really. I knew that Emma would need somebody to support her. I knew I didn't want to leave her unsupported in an environment like the FBI, which back in the early 80s was still completely male dominated, had all of the systemic sexism that you would imagine existed back in the early 80s. So I knew that she needed a partner, and I knew I wanted her to have a male partner, and that he would be somebody who had experienced trauma himself, and in Travis's case, he's gone through grief. So, he's in a position where he's emotionally sensitive to Emma's experience. And that allows him to be a good support, a good emotional support for her. And also, he understands law enforcement, so he's able to help her navigate that world. He becomes like her kind of secret weapon, I guess, in how to navigate the FBI and police and all of that stuff. Not only is she unfamiliar with it, but she's actively hostile towards it because nobody rescued her from her attacker. She rescued herself. So she's kind of resentful and wary of the FBI right from the word go.
Worldwide and across both adult and YA fiction, there seems to be such an appetite for crime stories. So I wanted to ask you, Ellie, why do you think that is?
I mean, I have been doing a little, reading up on this because it's fascinated me as well. I mean, I follow publishing trends. Part of being a writer means that you have to keep current with what's happening in the market. And one of the things I did notice pretty much straight away as soon as lockdown started was the surge in popularity in some genres of fiction. And obviously romance and fantasy and science fiction, there was some growth there. But crime and thrillers had like a 200% increase in popularity and sales, which was mind-boggling. So I was very happy about that, as you can imagine. I have a couple of theories, and one of them is that people are fascinated by the question at the heart of the crime story, which is, about good and evil, I guess, the human face of good and evil. And I also think that people are drawn to thrillers because I think Stephen King talks about it as a catharsis, that you feel this kind of adrenalized rush of terror in this controlled, safe way through the pages of a book. I do agree with that to some extent. But I also think that somebody else suggested that horror and thrillers, they give us an inoculation of fear, that, when everything around us is scary, getting that opportunity to read something that's scary is a way of reminding ourselves that we can cope with fear, we can keep going, and that we can kind of carry on and overcome our fear to continue surviving. I think actually a large part of people's interest in, scary or thrilling or nail-biting fiction does come from that, particularly at the moment when everything outside is scary as well.
Ellie, as you mentioned, you're a high school teacher and you still teach as well as write. So I wanted to ask, do your students know about your writing and what do they think?
Yes, some of them do. Some of them have found my online author profile, and it seems to be a subject of, I wouldn't say great interest, great amusement, I think would be the word I would describe it as. They just think it's a bit of a laugh, really, that they've got a teacher who's also an author. It would be like if I had any other slightly oddball, side gig, like if I was a jockey or something like that, in my spare time. It's as equally weird to them as being an author. I've got a couple of kids in my classes who are like, oh, they think it's cool, but I think probably most of them think that I'm a bit of a nerd.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording, but a while ago I was chatting with another fabulous Aussie YA author, Danielle Binks, who is, as you may know, a very vocal advocate for the Love Oz YA movement. So I understand this is something you're also involved in. So I wondered if you could tell us how that came about.
Danielle, she is such a sweetheart. Love Oz YA came about in 2015. I'm sure Danny, gave you a bit of info about it. There was a conference called Reading Matters that was held by the State Library of Victoria. And it was a conference that was held biannually to celebrate Australian literature for teenagers. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore, which is really sad because, I thought it was a great resource for librarians and for teachers and for booksellers and publishers to get the word out about some of the amazing YA literature that's out there and being written by local authors. And I think that was when we realised in 2015 the Australian Library Information Association organised a poll of popular books in Australian libraries. And one of the things they discovered was that Australian titles, Australian written titles, do extremely well in every category of fiction, non-fiction, children's books, until you get to teenage books. And then suddenly there's almost no Australian titles in the list of popular books read by teenagers that are, read through libraries. So I think in that year, there was, out of the top 10 list, there were only 2 Australian books on the top 10 most read YA books in Australian libraries. And my first book, Every Breath, which came out in 2013, that was actually on the list.
Oh, wow.
So, so I felt really lucky that it had made that list. And I was a bit staggered as well because it was the only book on that list that didn't have a major film associated with it. You know, the other books were all big name American books. They had a lot of PR around them. They had, posters on buses and films. And I think for the health of the industry, it's really important that we have those big books. But at that time, we were becoming more aware of the fact that Australian YA literature was kind of getting drowned out in its own market. So we thought, we'll start this campaign. It'll be grassroots and it'll be a bunch of us authors all getting together with, publishers, representatives, also booksellers and librarians and teacher librarians. And we all went to a nearby bar and we all sat around and having a glass of wine with a big piece of butcher's paper in front of us. And I was taking down notes about ideas of what we could do to help promote and advocate for YA literature. Another author, Emily Gale, she's a YA author, but she was also working at Readings bookstore in Melbourne at that time. And she got on social media and started, talking about it. And we were throwing around ideas about what to call it. And we came up with the idea of using a hashtag LoveAusYA. And that became our moniker, I guess. It sort of took off from there. And look, it's still around and about, and I think publishers are still promoting it as a tool. It gives librarians, it gives teachers and booksellers something to sort of check and sort of say, oh yeah, well this is an Australian YA book, so we can, we might be able to promote it more heavily. We might, the author may even live in the local area. So you get to connect authors with booksellers, which is really good, and with local schools as well. I still run Love YA Book Club online on Facebook. We started that about 4 years ago. We've got over 700 members now. So it's really important still, I think, to remind local teenagers that there's a whole lot of fantastic literature written in this country specifically for them by local authors, because a lot of them still don't know that it's out there.
Absolutely fantastic. So if listeners out there want to support Australian YA literature, please head over to the Facebook page, which has the handle Love Oz YA. Is that right?
Yeah, it's hashtag LoveAusYA Book Club on Facebook, or you can just Google hashtag LoveAusYA. And you'll find lots of, you'll get directed to the Love YA website, which is still used quite heavily, I think, as a resource, particularly for school librarians. There's posters and there's info and there's reviews and things like that, which helps to support librarians in schools who are trying to advocate for local teenage literature.
So having just explained that you're a YA author, and I know that None Shall Sleep has, as the main protagonist, 2 teenage FBI recruits, I guess. But
yeah.
I would say that the book has much broader appeal. And obviously, I'm a near 50-year-old woman and I've read and absolutely loved this book. So I wanted to ask you, do you get a sense that many adults read your books along with your YA audience?
Yeah, I think they do. I have to always kind of keep that in mind too. My first book came out in 2013, and at that stage, I think most of the kids that were reading it were between 14 and 16. So, I have to assume now that those kids are in their early 20s and that they're still interested in the sorts of things that interested them back then. Because quite often, I think your reading habits set a little bit when you're in your teenage years. It seems to be a really formative time, that kind of in your early teens. The stuff that you read then seems to be the things that you keep an interest in and that you still like when you're grown. There's the whole issue of YA being quite heavily bought by adults in the general market. So, like, I think the last statistics that we had on it said that 55% of YA books are actually bought by adults to be read by adults. So there's a strong interest out there still for YA books from, grown-ups.
Ellie, many writers listen to this podcast, and I wondered, for those who are writing or wanting to write or to get published, what would be your top 3 tips?
Top 3 tips, writing tips. This is, one of those things that I'm often asked, but I'm always reluctant to answer. There's a lot of rules out there and a lot of prescriptive kind of advice about how to write and how to write well and all this sort of stuff. And, particularly around this time of year, just before NaNoWriMo starts in November, the National Novel Writing Month, a lot of people are looking for advice and information about writing, which is fair. But I also don't believe that there's any one way to write. I think it really is dependent on the style that you like, the way that works best for you. So I would say, first of all, don't get too caught up in whether or not you're doing it right, Like, people can get really confused about whether or not they're doing the writing in the right way. It's like, well, there's no right way to write. You have to figure out the way that works best for you, and also the way that works best for your book or for your project, because, it can change with each book. The way I write now, or the book that I'm writing now, I'm writing it in a slightly different way to the way that I wrote my last book, for instance. So the project kind of dictates to some extent the way you're going to tackle it. My other 2 biggest pieces of advice would be read a lot, read in the genre and the category that you love, because I'm assuming that you're going to write something that you love, but it's really good to be able to read and see what's already out there and see what's been done, just so that you have an understanding of what's on the market already if you're looking to write to publish. I still think that the only piece of writing advice that I ever got that I've continually stuck with was from Stephen King, and his whole thing was just bum glue. You just have to sit there and you just have to do the work until it's done. He sort of says it's like any other profession. It's like laying brick, or, you just have to do the work. So often that involves planting yourself in the chair with your laptop or with your notebook and just staying the course until it's finished, basically, because there's a lot of distractions out there. I have to turn off all of my Wi-Fi and everything like that to really concentrate. Bum glue. That's my biggest piece of advice.
Well, I love it, and thank you very much. So, Ellie, what's next? You mentioned briefly that you're working on something else at the moment.
I've actually just sold. Well, I've just sold one book. That'll be the book that comes after None Shall Sleep. And we haven't got an official title and we haven't got an official launch date or anything like that yet. So I'm afraid I'm not allowed to speak much about that one. It's this weird embargo thing in publishing where you're not allowed to talk about it until they've made the official announcement. All I can say about that one is that it is historical fiction again. So I know you might find this equally shocking. Yeah, I know. 1982 is considered historical fiction. And I know, it's so weird for me too. This one set in 1943. Even I can consider it historical fiction. It's again led by girls, and it's to do with coding, and there's a murder mystery. That's about as much as I can say without giving too much away. That probably already gives you a bit of an idea anyway. And then the one I'm working on now is I'm fiddling with the sequel to None Shall Sleep. I actually started writing parts of a sequel. As soon as I finished writing None Shall Sleep, I started work on a sequel. But I don't yet have the green light for it. So I'm just going to keep writing it and keep my fingers crossed, and in the hope that my publisher is going to turn around and say, oh, we really liked that book. Perhaps we'll do another one. So That is my plan, my cunning plan.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds really exciting. I, for one, would be, voting for a yes for a sequel. Ellie, I'm delighted to have discovered you and your gripping book, None Shall Sleep. I'll be working my way through your backlist before too long and encourage other crime fiction fans to do the same. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudine. It's been really delightful to be here.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.